consumer bankruptcy. Recording in progress. Okay. So I think that now I can move. That's for motivation of this topic. So minimum wages is a topic that economists, we always like to talk about. It's always a relevant topic, not only for economists, for policymakers, and for a lot of people. In the case of the US, and in the last 10 years, or around 10 years, there have been substantial increases in the minimum wages. At the state level, so then the US, you have the federal minimum wages, which haven't been changed since I think it's 2009, if I remember correctly. And it's stayed there to $7.25 per hour, but many states can set their minimum wages above the federal level. And so in the last year, 29 states, plus the District of Columbia, has set their minimum wages above these federal minimum wages. And in many cases, they had planned to get to a $15 minimum wage or wage per hour. This year, again, there is a renewed attention because now they are not only talking about at the state level, the minimum wages, but there are proposals and talking about increasing the federal minimum wages to $15 per hour. Now, something that we notice is a lot of the debate on empirical or political or academic debate on minimum wages is over the labor market consequences of minimum wages, particularly when we talk about the employment effect or earning effect. In the academic and empirical academic literature, there is like a huge disagreement, and I think that it will always be a huge disagreement about this effect of minimum wages on employment. Until a couple of years, it seems that the disemployment effect of minimum wages was relatively small. It looked like the literature was getting into not a consensus, but a less disagreement. But this recent, and I was looking at a recent MBR paper that actually put this debate again, and it's talking that depending on the size of the minimum wage, it can actually be the size of the minimum wage increase, the disemployment effect can be big. Now, we don't want to tackle this question in particular. And something that we notice is that this debate is everything about the employment or the labor consequences of minimum wages, but there is a recent literature that is also focusing on the effect on credit markets. And in particular, there is a couple of papers, or more than a couple, but two recent papers talking about credit availability, liquidity, credit card delinquency, or credit scores. And something that we found and exploring this, let's say, relatively new literature on the effect of minimum wages on credit market is the effect or the particular effect on consumer bankruptcy. And I will be more detailed about what is consumer bankruptcy, but for now, it is enough to think about consumer bankruptcy as a legal or a formal way to default on your unsecured debt. And by unsecured debt, and I mean any debt that is not backed by an asset or by a collateral. Think about credit cards, personal loans, unpaid bills, etc. Any liability that doesn't have any asset backing this liability. So in the US, the short story is that you can legally remove this obligation and don't pay this debt under some condition, some circumstances. But of course, it had a cost or different costs, and the big one is that you will have a record in your credit record. You will have a bankruptcy flag, which is probably the most derogatory flag that you will have in your credit records that will reduce the possibility of getting credit, but not also credit. Also, this credit record is being used, so there is evidence that it's been used in job application. If you want to rent an apartment or a house, some people check your credit records to kind of evaluate your how trustworthy you are as a person. And so we think that within this new literature of understanding the effect of consumer bankruptcy on the credit market, the particular effect on consumer bankruptcy on this legal procedure is not being explored. So the particular question that we want to ask is, can we get an estimate of the effect of minimum wages on consumer bankruptcy? And for that, we exploit cross-state variation in minimum wages. As I said at the beginning, there is a federal minimum wages that is like a floor, kind of redundant, minimum and floor. But again, every state can set their minimum wages, and there are many states who set their minimum wages above these federal minimum wages. So there is differences across the states. And we use county level bankruptcy rate and to exploit these differences in minimum wage and how it affects different bankruptcy rates in different counties belonging to different states for the period of 1991 to 2007. So the particular answer or question that we want to do is tell you what is this estimate this effect, this reduced form effect of minimum wages on consumer bankruptcy. Now, a little bit more of background to understand these scenarios. So now I can give a little bit more details about consumer bankruptcy in the US. So I mentioned before there is a legal way to default or a formal way to default. There's always informal default or delinquency, which is just I don't pay my debt and let's see what happens. Here in the bankruptcy, you apply for bankruptcy in a court and you fill your petition for bankruptcy. And for consumer bankruptcy, I'm not talking about firm bankruptcy, it's consumer bankruptcy. There are two ways to do this. One is called Chapter 7, consumer bankruptcy. And this Chapter 7 is a liquidation chapter. So you are allowed to not pay your debt, or your debts are your liabilities removed. But in exchange, you have to surrender some assets that you had above some levels, some exemption levels. In practice, the people who apply for this are people who have assets below this exemption level, so they get rid of their debt without giving any asset, and their income, future income and current income are protected from any debt collection. So in that sense, this is kind of the very generous, or why the US bankruptcy system is considered relative to other part of the world like a very generous because of this Chapter 7. Chapter 13 is more a repayment plan. You can get some reduction in your the amount of unsecured debt that you can discharge, but it's a repayment plan, usually 5 or 7 years. As I said, filing for bankruptcy is not free. It is true that in Chapter 7, in almost all the cases, you don't surrender any asset because you had no asset above this exemption level. You are usually these low asset filers, but you have this big history. In your credit history will appear for 10 years that you had applied for bankruptcy, and that will appear in your credit record, and you had a lot of consequences. So you can think of the cost of bankruptcy, not only the debt discharge, but also the fees that you pay and the consequences of having this bankruptcy flag in your credit records. So that's bankruptcy. On the other hand, we have minimum wages. We know that the goal of the minimum wages are to improve the earnings, or you can think about more labor market conditions in terms of earnings for relatively young, middle income, and low earning workers. So a particular subgroup of workers within the income distribution. But this characteristic of the workers that are supposed to the minimum wage to aim are also characteristic of many of the people who file for bankruptcy. And moreover, the people who file for bankruptcy, they have a strong labor market attachment in the sense that the employment rate of the subpopulation of bankruptcy is bigger than the employment rate in the population. Right? This is there's a lot of other characteristics how there's similar characteristic in the subpopulation that is affected by the minimum wages and a lot of people in the subpopulation that use bankruptcy. And finally, we can see like the monthly wages for people filers in Chapter 7. And so this is using administrative data for 2007, and we only have access to that year, so that's why we are using that year. If you look at the 25th and 50th percentile of the median For Chapter 7, their monthly wages is between 1,000 and 460 and less than 2,000 for Chapter 7. And for Chapter 13, it's a little bit more, between 1,500 and 2,500. If you think about the minimum wage in that year, that was between $5.85. If you look at the federal, or in some states like California, was more than $9. Making the calculation for a full-time minimum wage worker, that will give you that the monthly wages to compare with this monthly wages for bankruptcy filer is very close to whatever is in between 1,000 and 1,500 or 1,600. So this is just kind of anticipating that it kind of within these two types of consumer bankruptcy, Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, it seems that minimum wages will be more relevant to Chapter 7 bankruptcy. So I wanted to keep that in mind, because I guess that in part that will explain one of the results that we had in the paper. One of the facts that we are documenting. This paper, we are just documenting these facts and of minimum wages on consumer bankruptcy. Something that will help us understand the reduced form. We are doing a reduced form, but still we want to have a framework how we think about this reduced form estimate. How can we interpret this reduced form estimate? So, and if you want to go into the theoretical size, the effect of minimum wages of consumer bankruptcy is ambiguous. And there's many mechanisms that you can start thinking about. One example is very related to the earning risk. On one hand, you have that think of a worker with very low disemployment risk. If that is the case, for a given level of debt, an increase in the minimum wage will increase or would increase his expected income, conditional obviously on remaining employed. That's what I said. If the disemployment risk, the risk of losing his job after the increase in minimum wages is lost. If that happens, of course, a higher expected income can accommodate even higher debt and reduce bankruptcy risk. Right? So that's one thing. But that also can, as I said, can encourage more borrowing. And another thing can happen, as we said, another thing that can happen is if we remove this, if you consider instead a worker with high disemployment risk, and an increase in the minimum wages can make this disemployment risk higher, and therefore his bankruptcy risk will increase. So just looking at how the minimum wage can affect the earning risk, we have on one hand, it can improve the earnings, the expected earnings conditional on remaining employed. But if it worsens the disemployment risk, then could increase your bankruptcy risk. So in that sense, it's ambiguous. And on top of that, you also have to think about lenders. If you are in the second group of workers with high disemployment risk and higher minimum wages, and make this disemployment risk higher for you, workers with price, or they will incorporate that higher risk into their interest rate and price this risk. And now if you are facing higher interest rate, that will discourage you from borrowing. So it could actually, due to this higher interest rate that lenders will charge you, and you may decide to borrow less, and this is an example of two mechanisms that can make this ambiguous effect of different effect on bankruptcy rates, and can make this ambiguous effect on realized bankruptcy rate. On one hand, you can have these workers that they reduce their risk, they improve their employment, and you can lower bankruptcy, realized bankruptcy, because these are improved earnings. But you have also this type of other workers that maybe they borrow less because they face higher risk, and now they borrow less and they reduce bankruptcy because they borrow less. But these are one example of how this ambiguous effect can happen. But you can think in other mechanism, and some of the literature have pointed out liquidity issues. You know that when you file for bankruptcy, there are some fees, some cost that you have to pay in order to file for bankruptcy. And then if you think about this liquidity effect, then okay, higher minimum wage on one hand can be good because it allows you to pay for some things that you need to pay, so it can avoid you to go into bankrupt. But on the other hand, if there is this real that this liquidity effect prevent people from filing for bankruptcy because they cannot pay the fee. If you give them the minimum wage, they can use that to pay the fee and file for bankruptcy. And there's a lot of other type of mechanism that you can think. And you have this ambiguous effect, or what will be which of these effects will be dominating. So therefore, what we want to do is first just get this reduced for an estimate, and then we can have a flavor of which are the mechanisms that probably are dominating. And in this paper, then we tackle this question of getting this reduced for an estimate and had an idea which are the mechanisms that are dominating. So for that, as I said, we're going to use the empirical specification is we're going to use differences in minimum wages across the state. We're going to use county level bankruptcy rate. And this is good because there is a lot of problem of using the endogeneity problem. There is a reason why some states decide their minimum wages. The minimum wages is decided at the state level. So maybe there's a reason why some states decide to have higher minimum wages. You can think about different shocks or different underlying conditions that changes in a given state and that affect their minimum wages, but also at the same time can affect the bankruptcy decision of the people in those states. If you use just state variation, then you can have this typical endogeneity problem. And one way to tackle this, taking advantage of the county level bankruptcy that we were able to get, is not to consider all the counties in the states, but only consider those counties who are at the border of the state. And the idea is that any economic shock or any changes in underlying condition that affect the state and potentially affect both bankruptcy and the policy, the minimum wage policy, any type of shock like this, for the counties that are in the border, this shock will be symmetric, will affect symmetric, will evolve symmetrically within this border. These counties that are in the border, they are very similar, they share the same labor market, the same credit market probably. In principle, there's not a reason to think that this shock that affects one of the states will stop at the border or will affect disproportionately differently to one of the counties in one state and differently to the other county. However, the policy is determined at the state level, so the policy stops at the border. And this is the sort of variation that we use to identify this effect of the minimum wages of consumer bankruptcy, this policy, this continuity at the state border. And this is not the only exercise that we do, but this is our preferred estimation that we have. I will show you later that we also use all the counties and we explore different specification of different robustness tests. But this is like for us, our preferred exercise. Now, in that sense, bordering county or a county that is a neighbor to, I don't know, if you are in, I study in Virginia, so if you're in First Path, Virginia, versus Montgomery County in Maryland, First Path, Virginia is a better control group for the increase in minimum wages in Maryland than another county in California. And that's kind of the idea. Of course, it is not free of limitation, this method. There is different concerns. The main of them has to do with the spillovers, that of course they are in bordering county, but also people can work in First Path, Virginia and live in Montgomery County in Maryland and the other way around, right? So there are this movement of people between these these two counties at the border. So increases in the minimum wages in Maryland can make people in Virginia go to find a work in Montgomery County in Maryland. And we test also for potential risks of these spillovers, and we found that at least for this question is not relevant, which is also consistent with some empirical work by Duvet and others on the effect of minimum wages on employment and earnings. The particular specification that we do, so how I'm with time, I came with the timing, is we do this difference and difference regression style, that the implementation is a difference and difference estimator, where we consider this is the bankruptcy rate in the county pairs. So the observation are county pairs, and on the logarithm of the minimum wages, we had county fits effect, per specific fits effect, other controls like county level income and all other stuff.
Diego, you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. So I will start just showing the results. So these are the effect of the estimation. That's what I make an emphasis on distinguishing between chapter 7 and chapter 13. We find that the effect of minimum wage reduces bankruptcy rate, but that's true only for chapter 7. And in particular, is true, or is bigger, the effect of, or was the effect of minimum wages on bankruptcy was bigger for chapter 7 before the bankruptcy reform. There was a huge bankruptcy reform in the US in 2005. A lot of detail. The main thing was that the cost of filing for bankruptcy was higher. Turned out to be higher after that reform. And we didn't find any effect for chapter 13 bankruptcy rate. And a key difference between chapter 13, in addition to the fact that usually they had a little bit higher income, not too much, but a slightly higher income, is that chapter 13 filer is a repayment plan. It's why is that repayment plan? Because these are people who hold a lot of home equity or a lot of equity on their home, and they don't want to go to chapter 7 because they can lose their houses. So they enter into this repayment plan. So we interpret this number where a 10% increase in the minimum wages reduces chapter 7 bankruptcy rates 0.011 percentage point. This is roughly 4% of the bankruptcy rate. I use a 0.25% bankruptcy rate in the population. This is not the ideal thing. Usually you think about bankruptcy rate at the household level, not the population. We do that only for data limitations. And to assess whether this is a big number or not, kind of a flavor, or whether this is the size of this number, if you think about an average bankrupt, the amount of debt discharged under chapter 7 for an average filer is $180,000. So if you think a 10% increase in minimum wage, which is something small, I mean, you think about from $8 to $8.80, that will imply a reduction in the amount of debt discharged under bankruptcy of $6 billion, or that is around 5% the amount of debt discharged for only a 10% at 80 cents in this example. I mean, you think about this, that the increases in minimum wages were some counties, sorry, some states from $5 to $10, the double. Plus, there are these other indirect effects of avoiding people going into bankruptcy related to avoiding having this record on their credit record, this flag on their credit record, and also the debt weight loss that you have to pay for bankruptcy in terms of the fees. As I said, we didn't find significant effect on chapter 13, and the effect on chapter 7 was bigger before the reform. These are the key exercises. Of course, for time constraint here, we don't have the time to go into the robustness, but I checked this spillover theme, committed variables, state levels, parallel trend assumptions, and also the choice. We repeat the exercise using all counties and using state different, and we found exactly pretty similar result. So just to finish, then we contribute to the literature providing this reduced form estimate that we can interpret in light of this mechanism that we talked a little bit at the beginning. So here are a little bit more in detail. And some of this result is consistent with other results. For example, in the literature, like Cooper and others last year found that the average amount of debt changes a little bit after minimum wage increases, but for subprime workers, it reduces. And this kind of speaks into this mechanism that we were talking about. If you are the worker with high disemployment effect, then actually the higher rates that you will pay will make you or discourage you from borrowing. And in that case, okay, bankruptcy falls, but as the result of lower borrowing. Another thing that you can think about is that Detlin and Sue, they documented delinquency of this informal default that I mentioned at the beginning. And they also find that increases in the minimum wage reduces this informal default, right? And this is consistent with what I found. Probably some of the the reduction in bankruptcy may comes from this lower delinquency, because many people go into delinquency before going into bankruptcy. And that's all. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Diego, for the excellent presentation. For the sake of time, let's move on to the next presentation by Joaquin, who is going to present a quantitative model of high-cost consumer credit. We're going to leave the Q&A for the end of the session. Okay. Joaquin, you have 25 minutes. You're on mute.
Thanks, Dimas. Okay, good. So this is what I'm working on, a quantitative model of high consumer credit. So I'm looking at for the U.S. at high cost consumer credit. This is basically, you can think about, a lot of people talk about this like alternative financial services. You know, kind of financial credit that's outside of the traditional financial system. You know, mostly banks. And in the U.S., a lot of people use these services, right? They think about payday loans, pawn shops, title lending, very expensive credit. I guess the most controversial among these financial services are these called payday loans, which is what most households use, and they're basically the most expensive thing you can find, right? Payday loans, you know, they're unsecured credit, and they're very expensive. And, you know, on average, the APR is like above 300%. That's pretty common. The median loan, they're very small, very short term, and people renew them, roll over them very frequently. Who takes this kind of loan? That's basically, you know, very low income households, below median income households, low wealth, in particular, very low liquidity. The story that you see in the data, people before taking one of these loans, they're basically, you know, exhausting their credit limits with credit cards, or they might not even have access to credit cards. They're applying to credit, they're getting rejected, and as soon as they exhaust their credit limits, they start taking these loans. That's kind of like the average borrower. The interesting thing is that in the U.S., at the state level, there's a lot of regulation, right? You know, you go to like 25% of the population, they live in states where this is completely banned, right? You cannot do payday lending in those states. The rest, you see states telling you, well, you cannot borrow more than some amount. You cannot borrow at interest rates that are above some amount also. There's all this sort of regulation, and very strict. If you look at the borrowing limits, like more than half of the borrowing limits are less than $500. So you cannot even take $500 in debt. In the majority of the population cannot even borrow more than $500. And so that basically takes me naturally to the research question of, at least from my agenda and of this paper, right? You know, well, what do we want to do about these markets, right? How do we want to regulate them? And what I'm going to do in this paper, I'm going to focus on one specific trade-off, and because the literature has been thinking about this. Well, you know, you can think on one hand, people take these loans because they're facing adverse shocks, right? Think about I guess in the US it's pretty common. You get a health bill, maybe if it's very bad, you go bankrupt, like what Diego was talking about. But if it's kind of intermediate, well, you might, you're desperate, you're willing to pay one of these very, very costly options. On the other hand, well, some people have self-control issues, right? They have some long-run preferences, but in the short run, they may be tempted to overconsume and eventually overborrow, right? So kind of, in my favor, asking to what extent do people use these markets to overborrow? And in the first case, when people are facing adverse shocks, that's a good thing. It's good that they have these options. Now, if people do have self-control issues, temptation issues, maybe regulation, maybe it'll be a good thing that regulators protect these consumers, right? Basically from themselves. The key thing that I'm adding in the literature is basically, well, I'm going to endogenize debt prices, right? They're going to reflect the risk of default. Borrowers will be able to default, so lenders will they know that, they incorporate that information and they price their loans. And this is key because I was telling you, regulation can make the people that suffer from temptation better off by restricting their options. But the market can do that too, right? If lenders are already constraining borrowers to some extent, that can completely crowd out regulation. Or it can go the other way. Being able to borrow at high rates, because that reflects default, that could even be exacerbating over borrowing, and maybe regulations have to be even stricter. So getting the endogenizing prices, that can be important for welfare and for what kind of regulations you need from the regulator, and how the efficacy of the regulation, right? And to give you the takeaway of this paper is basically, well, so to give these regulations that we see in the data a chance, we're going to explore to what extent do people overborrow because of temptation. That's our key friction for regulation. But I'm also looking at this other friction that we think is relevant, right? People can default, lenders know that, they price this in their debt. So there's a financial friction. To what extent does that financial friction crowd out the need for regulation of these people? And what I find actually that it completely crowds out the need for, the regulator doesn't need to come and put borrowing limits if you are worried that people have temptation. The lenders have that already. Yeah. To make sense of the risks that we observe, we basically have to go some other way. But this is where the literature was looking at. Basically, it was quasi-hyperbolic preferences. So now I'm adding this thing up, and this is what I'm finding. At least for the case of self-control temptation, basically, you should not worry about regulating this. Lenders are already doing that. And where am I standing in the literature? Well, there's this big macro literature on unsecured credit, and Diego's paper. Diego has worked on this kind of models. Basically, there's this set of tools, looking at dynamics, stochastic generative models, studying bankruptcy, studying credit card debt, how that sector has changed, how its technology has changed. And what I'm doing is, yes, I'm grabbing those tools and bringing them to a new context, right? Very high cost consumer borrowing. And then there's a set of papers that they're trying to model these markets also. Basically what they were doing there are two things. One is they're thinking about quasi-hyperbolic preferences, right? People are time inconsistent, and that's good. That's basically where I'm coming from, but I'm endogenizing prices, right? I'm giving the possibility of overborrowing with endogenous pricing. The other way that people have gone is basically looking at some kind of market power in these markets, and we're actually doing that ourselves, right? We're exploring some in another paper to what extent there's market power in these markets, and could that justify interest rate signals? So basically, what I'm going to do in my presentation, I'm going to show you a two-period model to give you a sense of the takeaway that I just showed you. And then very briefly, what is the quantitative model and where I'm getting my results from. Okay. So kind to introduce you into what these temptation self-control preferences are, basically I'm just going to look at two-period model, endowment economy, no uncertainty, and fixed interest rate, kind of like small open economy. What are these households going to do? Well, they're going to maximize, they're going to choose their consumption levels and their assets, and their choices are going to be determined by a compromise between two kinds of utility. The commitment utility kind of reflects their long-run preferences, but in the short run, they might be tempted to consume more today, right? So if you look at the discount factors that govern each of these utilities, well, the temptation utility, that has a lower discount factor, right? You know, you have a preference, you have some data for the long run, but in the short run, when you have the option, you might, oh, I'm tempted to overconsume today. If I have that problem, I might be able to do that. That's how his choices are determined. Now, the utility of people that have these preferences looks like this. Sure, that's your actual choice, but you're going to lose what's called your maximal temptation. That's basically the utility evaluated at the options that I would take if I was completely tempted, if I was only following the delta beta discount factor. Just to really show why we can make these households better off, it's basically just think about gamma, which is basically telling me how much how much my choices are driven by temptation. Think about gamma being very high. So basically, the temptation utility and maximum temptation are going to cancel because they're the same. And my choices are going to be driven by delta beta, but evaluated at the commitment utility, right? And you know, the choices under full temptation are driven by delta beta, but the welfare is evaluated by beta. You know, that's not optimal, right? That's not the allocation to maximize the commitment utility. So this household, through some regulation, for example, with a borrowing limit, like the ones that we observe in data, you can make them happier. And this is basically what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you this. Okay, this is the utility function. There's some budget constraints for this imaginary allocation, which is C tilde, and a regulator that's going to impose a borrowing limit. What happens when I impose a borrowing limit on these preferences? Yes, I can restrict their options. What I'm plotting here is basically welfare, total welfare, as a function of different borrowing limits. And as the borrowing limit to the right is just a tighter borrowing limit. The interesting thing is that as I tighten the borrowing limit, utility immediately starts to increase because I'm controlling the maximal temptation, and it achieves actually a unique maximum here, right? That's basically I constrain the agent so much that I basically got rid of the full temptation, and I'm making his allocations basically a singleton. You know, this is the only thing you can choose. Your commitment utility, the allocation that maximizes your commitment utility. That's why we can make this preference, these people better off. Even though we're saying, well, now you have a set that is more a smaller set to choose from, right? You can do that and make them happier. Standard exponential discount, that will not be the case, right? And now going to the actual point of the paper, which is basically, well, what if we have financial frictions? Maybe that's already constraining these agents. So now, in this very simple model, I basically just add some uncertainty, right? Now your second tier endowment can fluctuate. It can be either high or low with some probability high. And I allow for a fall. Now households in the second tier, they can say, well, I just don't want to pay you back. And the only thing, this notation is more compressed here, but the only thing that I changed basically in my second period, what I can do now is choose, well, if I pay back, right, here you go, this is your money. Now, if I don't pay back, okay, great, I got rid of my debt, but I suffer a utility cost land. That's basically, you know, defaulting, and that's not a nice situation. There's things that we don't know how they work. This kind of reduced form of model default, right? I suffer some utility cost land because of default. It's the good thing is that I got rid of my debt, but I don't like to be in that situation. And the rest is basically now households can default, and lenders, what are going to do? They're going to price their loans, right? How are they going? Oh, so here basically I normalized interest rate are equal to 1. So basically, what is the price of a loan here? And a loan of size A2, well, that's basically just the probability of everything, right? 1 minus the probability that you default. And the interesting thing that happens when you do that, 4 different levels of the cost of defaulting, lambda, which I just told you what it was. The interesting thing is that you can get many different scenarios, right? Here, I'm applying the same as before, total welfare as a function of the regulatory borrowing limit that the regulator imposes. And what you have there is basically, the blue line is what we had before. There was this nice, unique maximum. Now that you allow for default, well, anything can happen, right? Think about this. When in the first case that I showed you, that was, lambda was huge. It was impossible to default. You would never default because it would basically be a very bad situation. As you start lowering the cost of default, let's say to some mid-level, which is the orange line, what's happening there is basically, well, households now, their actual choices, they move away to very high levels of debt, right? Now, because now I defaulting is not that bad. Sure, I'm gonna pay a higher interest rate because I can default on that debt, but now I can actually get rid of my debt. In that, if things go bad in the next period. So now basically all borrowing, commitment choices, actual choices, and temptation choices move completely away to very high levels of debt. So now if the regulator, let's say those were the conditions in the market, the regulator will still benefit from bringing a borrowing limit, but it would have to be a much higher borrowing limit than before, right? Now, if you go to the borrowing limit that the blue line was suggesting, that's just too strict. The optimal one is at higher levels of debt, because now people are even their commitment choice, their longer interests are telling you, borrow more. That's completely fine. That's justified. Now, as you keep lowering the cost of default, which we don't know in the quantitative model, we're going to estimate it. As you keep lowering the cost of default, at some point, what's going to happen? Well, the price of the lenders are going to drop to 0 with the level of debt very quickly. And what that's going to happen is the lender is basically constraining the temptation choices, but actually also the actual choices of the lender, of the borrower. And when that happens, well, this is utility as a function of the borrowing limit. Now there's nothing you can do. The lender, maybe in an inefficient way, but the lender already took care of that. The cost of default is so low in the market that, well, that can completely crowd out the regulator's borrowing limit. That we see that in some cases it works, but in other cases it might not. So, which is what we were after. So, so now, basically, to finish, actually, in the last part of this presentation, again, this is the mechanism that we're finding. And what I'm going to do is, well, I just write down a quantitative word that features this basic trade-off that I was talking about, right? And what is that? Well, this is very high frequency borrowing. We're going to have basically a monthly model, endowment economy. It's going to be an overlapping generation model. There's going to be uninsurable idiosyncratic risk. Think about when I was telling you about what is the policy trade-off that I'm looking at. Well, some households have bad luck in very bad states of the world. Okay, yeah, that's basically things going wrong for some people and making them willing to pay these very big rate, very large rates. So we're going to have that kind of risk, both in income and expenditures. Right? You need both in these markets to get some borrowing. Income risk is basically insufficient to get any borrowing. And we're going to have types of households, right? We're going to have, standard exponential discount that we usually have in our macro model. Some household that has a discount factor of beta. And what we're going to see is that with the usual discount, very high discount factor, we're not going to get any borrowing. To be willing to pay these rates, even with expenditure shocks, you're going to have to start lowering. There's some people that have very low discount factor. Now, the question there is basically, well, But how do we distinguish between an impatient household, somebody that has a low discount factor, which I don't want to protect because he's just happy by borrowing a lot, and somebody that has temptation, has a short run temptation, right? So we're going to have these three types of agents, and kind of in my estimation, that was kind of a tricky thing. How do I separate these households? And I'm going to tell you in 1 minute. And the last ingredient was, prices are going to be endogenous, and they're going to reflect the risk. How do I estimate this? Well, there's a ton of observables from payday lending. You see people borrowing, on average $400. Some of them borrow very, very small loans, like some people completely borrow, max out their borrowing. They go, half of them borrow $500, which is the maximum that you can borrow. I'm using data from Florida. That's the maximum you can borrow there. But other people, they don't exhaust it. The regulators, they take 100, 200, $300, stuff like that. Then there's actually a distribution of sequences. On average, people roll over payday loans for like 4 months. You even see a fraction of people borrowing further for maybe even a year. But you also see people borrowing 1 month, 2 loans, 2 14-day loans, 1 14-day loans, stuff like that. There's a lot of heterogeneity. There's default rates. We're going to use default rates. Very short sequences get defaulted. 16% of short sequences are defaulted. But if you look at very long sequences, very frequently they end up in default. And we're going to use the fraction of payday borrowers. In payday lending, it's nearly 5%, almost 5% of people borrowing at this rate. So one just thing, this is going to help discipline a lot of things from on. One thing, the regulations that we see, all of them affect in some way, directly or indirectly, this moment. So it's this is a big deal. You want to be able to reduce it. Now the problem was that when you look at those observables, there's an identification problem. An impatient household and a household that suffers from temptation, they look in a very constrained economy like this one, they look exactly the same. They can't look exactly the same. Basically, you can have somebody that's impatient and somebody that has a temptation. And in the observables that I just showed you, how much they borrow, how much time they roll over, how much they default, these guys look exactly the same. And that's a problem because if you do one or the other, the policy consequences are very different. And what I'm going to do with that is, well, basically, some people went to payday loan stores and they asked a very important question. And they offer some households that borrow in these markets and say, okay, I'm going to give you $100, but you cannot borrow in the next 2 months, right? How valuable is that contract to you? And the interesting thing is that the valuations of that contract were incredibly heterogeneous, right? This is basically from their paper, from the Zinman et al. Paper. And the interesting thing is that valuations, you see people that value that contract even very low amounts. That means people that you don't allow people to borrow, they suffer like crazy because you're going to give them $100. They really don't like that. But you do see people that really like that. You don't see valuations that are above $100. There's a lot of heterogeneity here. And this is what's going to actually help us discipline this part of the model, right? Somebody that's impatient and you tell them not to borrow, they really don't like that. Somebody that has temptation and you tell them, hey, don't borrow, they really like that because they have a demand for commitment. This is going to be this commitment device for them, right? They're going to discipline themselves, which they have self-control issues. They're just going to use this contract to discipline their future self. So I'm going to use the average valuation and look at the fraction valuations that are above 100, which you couldn't get from an exponential discount, but you could get from the temptation. Once you do that, you do start being able to separate these guys that look very similar in the usual observable, but when you ask these kind of questions to them in an experiment, you can disentangle those forces. And basically, what I'm finding is basically among borrowers that go to these markets, well, basically basically 1/3 of them seems to have self-control temptation issues. And the remaining, they're just a combination of patient households that have very bad shocks, or just inpatient households that don't have that bad shocks, but they're so impatient that they're not able to generate enough savings to avoid the payment. So one interesting thing that we did this way of estimating the mood, but does this make sense? And I went to the CFPB has a survey. They ask people about questions about temptation, questions about their long-run preferences. And the interesting thing is that this 1/3 of people that and my model seem to suffer from temptations, seem to have some self-control issues. That's basically what you get in this completely independent data, survey data, right? So things seems to be reasonable. Now, well, so we still have people that are gonna suffer like crazy when you put this regulation. We know that they're gonna suffer. Now, the interesting thing from the paper is that, okay, we detected people that have temptation, they can benefit from regulation, but we actually see that they suffer. If you think about it in a scenario, this is a counterfactual experiment, ban payday lending, how much do you like that, do you not like that? We see on average, newborn households that have temptation, they lose this amount of consumption because of panic payday. Now that's very small, it's incredibly small. The losses for inpatient households are basically like 3% of the consumption, huge losses. So we already knew that that was not a good idea for them, but even for households that suffer from temptation, this is a loss. Now this is very small, and the reason that it's very small is because when you zoom into the temptation agents, now here there's an income distribution. And the thing is basically why this is negative is because a lot of them are completely constrained. In bad states of the world, they're high income expenditure, high expenditure shocks, low income shocks. In those states of the world, prices of lenders are completely constraining those agents, and constraining them further through regulation is just going to make them suffer more. So this small loss, when you actually go and look at the population that actually borrows, the losses are even bigger. And even in this model, yeah, we see the losses, but when you start looking at relatively high income households that have temptation, those are actually benefiting from the regulation. And that's why, because, relatively high income households, they face this very long price schedules, and they can actually eat overborrow at some point. But on average, newborns with temptation are suffering from this regulation. And that's kind of the point of this one, to what extent households that have temptation, we know there are households that have this is an important problem for this market, but we see that a lot of them are already being constrained by lenders. And that's basically this paper. Just to conclude, we see all of these regulations, and in the US, in these markets, you can think of many trade-offs. This is one that the literature has been studying. What I'm adding is basically this identification thing, separating households suffering from temptation in inpatient households and endogenous in prices. When you do that, you start seeing that if you think that this is an issue for these borrowers, these regulations that we see are not justified by this friction, right? The other friction, consider financial friction, which we know that are there, they're already taken care of. These regulations, to justify them, you just have to think about something. It's not through quasi-hyperbolic preference implementation and stuff like that. That's basically my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. Again, for the sake of time, let's leave the Q&A for after the last session. Let's start now with the last session, the last presentation. Yes, there's some.
Hey, Dimas, I'm
Yeah.
actually not seeing your presentation right now. So in my case, I just see a black screen and it says you're sharing, but I don't see the presentation.
The same with me.
Yeah. Good. Now it works. Yeah.
Can you see the screen now? Yeah. I mean, Zoom got a bit
Yeah,
more
works in.
today. Let's see. You're seeing the slides right now, right? Perfect. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. Thank you for the patience. And sorry for the issues. So the last presentation is by me. Today I'm going to talk about credit rights and bank competition. This is a joint work with Thiago Silva from the Brazilian Central Bank. So the usual disclaimer applies. So to motivate the paper, we kind of all know that there is substantial evidence that strong credit protection is crucial for financial development. We know that in places where laws are enforced, right, and actually creditors can recover their loan, even in case of default, this actually predicts more credit. And the main channel is that when creditors know they can recover this credit, even in this worst case scenario, they tend to offer better loan terms to borrowers, as Joaquin was also saying, right? When they know they can recover, there's not going to be a lot of default, they offer lower interest rate and more credit to borrowers. And because of this, there is also very important economic consequences, such as higher consumption. Now these borrowers can borrow to consume, or borrow to invest in their firms, or can actually hire any employees, or can actually open new firms, right? So there is this kind of wide range of economic effects that that actually are caused, right, by this strong credit protection. So this, we already know there's a lot of evidence on these effects on the borrower's debt capacity, right, and what's the credit availability to those borrowers as well. However, we don't know a lot about what's happening, what's the effect of this credit protection across different creditors. So what's the effect across different, for instance, in this case, banks, okay? And this is important because there are actually some channels that predict that different banks would actually be affected differently by this. And because of that, there might be actually consequences for bank competition as well. So one of the channels is the information asymmetry channel, right? Which is one of the biggest problems in lending. When I'm a bank, I'm trying to lend to a new borrower, I'm afraid I don't know that borrower, so I don't have enough information about them. So more often than not, I will not offer then the right interest rate, because I'm actually going to be imputing this fear, right, that the borrower is going to default. So because of that, actually, when you think about it, incumbent banks that are already lending to that borrower might actually have an advantage, and not only that, might actually have a market power over that borrower, right? So, and because they have this market power, they can actually charge high interest rates again compared to a counterfactual where there is no such market power. And market power comes because any new lenders will be afraid of lending to this borrower because of information asymmetry. So those incumbents are actually going to have this information already because they have this relationship with that bank, and therefore this creates this market power. So when you think about it, when you have actually stronger collateral, now it's easier for the bank to recover the collateral in case of default. This reduces this fear of lending to this borrower, even if I don't have enough information about them. So it actually reduces the information asymmetry problem and reduces the market power of incumbent banks. And a consequence here is an increase in bank competition now, because now there are more banks willing to lend to that particular borrower. And the second channel is a financial constraints channel. Because it improves credit rights and actually makes lending to some borrowers safer, you might actually reduce the riskiness of the credit portfolio of the bank. The bank is maybe more incentivized to lend more insecure credit. And this might actually relax the financial constraints because they're lending more insecure credit. This reduces the risk-weighted assets and frees up some capital for the bank to actually lend more to other borrowers, right? So again, as a consequence here, previously constrained banks might increase credit supply, and this, because really constrained banks are usually smaller banks, might actually increase bank competition as well. So there are these main channels that talk about this effect, but we still don't understand very well empirically whether this happens and what these channels might be actually driving these results. So to tackle this question, there are also empirical challenges. First of all, one, we need to observe lending data at a very granular level, right, to be able to talk about the heterogeneous effects across borrowers and across banks, which is also hard to come by. And the second is in the endogeneity problem, right, because credit rights and bank outcomes, credit outcomes are usually simultaneously determined in areas where financial development is high, usually have more credit rights and vice versa. And a counterfactual is we need to come up with a counterfactual as always, that in the sense what bank outcomes would be in the absence of any changes in credit rights as well, okay? And to solve these challenges, what we do in this paper, we're gonna actually use a very detailed credit registry data from Brazil, which information at a granular level, at the loan level data. And we're gonna do that exploiting also bankruptcy reform in 2005 in Brazil that significantly increased the recovery rate of creditors. And this bankruptcy reform, in contrast with the previous two papers, is actually a corporate bankruptcy reform, so for firms. And the idea here is what we're going to do is compare outcomes in treated versus control areas in Brazil for different banks with different size, ex-ante size, or financial constraint. Okay, and the treatment, I'm going to be a little bit more detailed later on, is actually defined by how efficient are the local courts in a particular municipality. So, and the idea behind this is actually when courts are efficient, they're going to be able to pass through the reform more efficiently, more rapidly. So if something in the law changes and the courts are efficient, this can be translated to enforcement basically. But if the courts are inefficient, and you can think of a case where they infinitely inefficient, then the law is never going to be able to be passed through to the final borrower or the bank, right? Because the courts are never going to enforce it. So with that idea, then we can actually compare areas with high versus low court efficiency to be able to talk about the effects of this reform. So just a preview of the results in case I don't manage to finish on time. So first of all, this reform has led to significant increase in credit in areas of stronger courts as predicted. But secondly, and this is the new part of my paper, is that this credit increase is concentrated in banks with a lower local market share. So those banks that are less relevant locally are the banks that experience the increase in credit. And I'm actually going to show you as well that the lenders that are actually the local leaders, the banks that are, have higher local market share, they're not affected by the reform. If anything, they're a little bit adversely affect the credit decreases after the reform. So as a result of these effects, local market competition increases after the credit rights reform. So regarding the mechanisms, I'm going to show that both these effects are particularly strong for opaque borrowers, so small and young firms, which supports the information symmetry channel. These are borrowers where you don't have a lot of credit registry, and borrowers probably they're initiating borrowing recently, so we don't have a lot of information about them. And what I also find is that banks' financial constraints do not play a role here. So banks with different financial constraints are not being affected differently. And the main takeaway of this paper, if anything, is that you have a credit rights reform that's supposed to change, right? credit conditions, the borrower's debt capacity, and this reform has also an effect on banking market structure. So regulators need to be aware of this because the reform might actually be creating this unintended consequence. In this case, it might be actually even a good consequence, but still it's affecting banking market structure. So I'm going to go very quickly on the literature review. So as I said, there is a large literature on creditor rights, right? It talks about this positive effect of credit rights. The exception here is a paper by Vic that talks that in some scenarios, you might, when you increase credit rights, banks might have a lot of power over the borrower, and the borrower might be afraid of actually borrowing from the banks because they're afraid of inefficient liquidation of the assets. And another exception is Lilienthal-Toll that talks about how credit can actually be reallocated after stronger credit rights, and this might actually harm some of the borrowers. What my paper does, in addition to this literature, is talk about another effect of credit rights, not only on credit per se, but on local market competition. Okay. So let me go a little bit over the institutional background, explain what this reform did. So before 2005 in Brazil, bankruptcy procedures, especially corporate bankruptcy procedures, were not very efficient in the sense that there is this understanding before 2005 where that when a firm files bankruptcy, the outcome should be liquidation. So there was liquidation bias in courts where the assets of the firm would be liquidated, and as a result, this is actually going to lead to a lower recovery rate, because it's when you liquidate these assets are distressed, you're actually going to liquidate them at a discount. And since this proceeds, the proceeds of the liquidation are being used to pay the creditors, when creditors are not going to get a lot of this recovery per asset sold, right? Because it's selling them at a discount. So this was one of the problems. And another problem is that secured creditors that lend with some sort of collateral, right? They had some collateral from the borrower. They're actually not very high in the priority list of bankruptcy repayments. So they actually came after labor and government claims. So first, the first to be repaid after bankruptcy would be labor, the wages. Then there would be the taxes, and the remaining, if any, would go to secured creditors. And yeah, it's even hard to think how much it's unsecured and even equity would get because of this, right? Finally, there is this issue of lengthy procedures. They can actually last, bankruptcy procedures can last for several years. There are examples of bankruptcy procedures lasting for 10 years even. So this is actually also leads to a reduction in recovery rate. So because of all these issues, the government in 2005 passed a law to try to fix this bankruptcy reform, try to improve the recovery rate of creditors. And the main change of these reforms, first of all, is that there is now a growing concern understanding that the goal of the bankruptcy procedure is to recover the firm. And because of that, the recovery rate actually is higher because you don't need to liquidate the assets. You can actually issue new debt or new equity to kind of try to repay the creditors. And second is that there was some change in this priority list. So labor still ranks first, but now it has a cap on the value that they can actually get. And secured claims are actually now ranked second before the government taxes. And these changes actually increased the recovery rate. So this is information from the World Bank doing business. I know they took a hit recently, but I don't think there is any reason to suspect that actually Brazil was kind of involved in this mechanisms of changing the statistics. So, but if you don't believe this graph, I'm also going to show you later on that actually credit is going to increase significantly because of the reform. But you can see from this graph is that the recovery rate is basically zero before the reform, and then it goes to 15 cents on the dollar after the reform. So there's actually a very sharp increase in the recovery rate. So from zero, basically, secured credits will get almost zero to 15% after the reform. So to be able to answer this question, I'm going to use this credit register data. It has data on 633 commercial, cooperative, and investment banks in Brazil, lending to about 1.58 billion distinct firms. So it's actually the universe of loans above a certain threshold. I think at the time of this analysis, it was $2,000. So above $2,000, we have the universe of these loans. We're going to have also information on firm registry, which has information on firm's location and industry from the Brazilian IRS. And finally, we're going to get data on court congestion, defined here as the number of pending cases per judge from the National Justice Council, and this is going to be an important measure in our difference. So let's talk a little bit about the main effect. So the challenge here is that this was a reform that affected the country, everyone at the same time. So how can we actually differentiate who is more affected, who is less affected? What's the counterfactor here? And what I'm going to do is borrow from an idea from Botticelli and Alencar, paper in QJ 2016, where stronger courts would effectively enact the reform, right? Because if courts are very efficient, then any changes in the law are going to be passed through to borrowers and banks. Anytime, for instance, very inefficient changes in laws are going to take a lot of time to actually reach, right, the banks and consumers affected. So with that idea in mind, what I'm going to do is compare bank level outcomes at the municipality level. So I aggregate this information at the firm level, at the municipality level per bank. I'm going to regress this against court congestion measure, which, as I said, is the backlog cases per judge in each municipality, and times opposed, which is equal to 1 after 2005 and 0 before, right? And this is going to be a difference in different setting where beta is our difference estimator. And what I actually can show, but I'm not going to show in the presentation for the sake of time, is that this measure of court congestion is strongly correlated with the time that it takes to sentence judicial cases and bankruptcies. So areas that are more congested are actually going to be less efficient, going to take longer time to sentence a case. And the idea is very simple, right? There are many more cases to be sentenced, so that's why the courts are inefficient. And then, I'm going to add a lot of controls as well in terms of specifications, branch density, average income, Gini index areas to be able to kind of rule out the fact that different areas, different court congestion might be different from to begin with. There may be different in other characteristics as well. So here's just a plot. You can see there is a lot of variability in this measure of court congestion over time, ranging from the lower quartile is 1,000 cases per judge to be sentenced, and the upper quartile is actually comes from 4,000 can actually reach 13,000. So there's a lot of variability here in this measure. So the first effect here is that the first question is what's the main effect of the reform? So I regress this changes in secured credit against this court congestion times post, and you can see that areas with higher court congestion, meaning inefficient courts, experience a decrease in credit relative to areas of efficient courts, right? And this is as predicted. Areas with efficient courts are going to experience actually an increase in credit as a result of the reform, because they're going to be able to pass through the law more efficiently, right? So this effect holds if I'm comparing same bank and quarter, right? Or same bank in the same state and quarter as well. Or if I add also municipality controls, taking into account these differences that areas with high versus low court efficiency might have. Now let's move on to the new part of the paper, which is kind of talk about the heterogeneous effects, right? What happens with the reform? So unconditionally across Brazil, there seems to have been an increase in bank competition, right? So bank competition seem to have increased. So here's a local HHI as of December 2004, so before the reform. And on the right-hand side, we have local HHI in 2007 after the reform. And you can see that the graphs suggest that local HHI decreased across Brazil as a result of several factors, right? But can you say something about how much of this is actually translated from the reform? So here, what I'm actually doing is plotting this local HHI, right, for efficient courts in this black solid line and inefficient courts in the gray line. And I actually set this curve to cross zero just before the reform in December 2004. And you can see while before the reform, they were following similar trends. After the reform, local HHI in areas of efficient courts dropped relative to areas with inefficient courts. And this is actually at the quarter level, very high frequency. And you can see that it actually just starts after the reform. So it seems that after the reform, there's something that changed that actually decreased a local HHI in areas that were more affected by the reform, okay? To kind of put this in a regression format and try to understand the effects of this reform for different banks, what I'm gonna do is interact my difference in difference estimator with a dummy equal to 1 if you are a local leader, meaning the bank that has higher market share in that municipality, and 0 otherwise. So you can see here in the first row that the difference effect is significant, right, for local leaders. So higher court congestion predicts lower credit, right, as expected. And for local leaders, this effect is muted. So what it seems to be the case is that the effect of the reform, the increasing credit in areas of higher court efficiency, happen only for banks that are not local leaders, right? And this is actually what driving this decrease in local HHI. So now let's talk a little bit about the mechanisms. I actually told you there are at least 2, this information asymmetry channel and the bank's financial constraints channel. To talk about the information asymmetry channel, we kind of need to understand why this effect was stronger, right, for firms where information asymmetry might be more of an issue, right? And in the literature, it's actually pretty standard that 2 variables actually predict this information asymmetry. First of all is firm size, right? And the second is firm age. So now what I'm gonna do is show the effects, different effects for some firm size. So now we're gonna exploit the richness of the data and exploit borrowing at the firm level. And then we're gonna classify firms into small, medium, and large based on official definition by the Brazilian government. And you can see that firms that are small experience a decrease in credit in areas of higher court congestion, or the flip side is that areas of lower court congestion, meaning more efficient, these firms experience a higher increase in credit, right? And this effect is not significant mostly for other larger firms, right? And you can see in these columns 5 to 8, this effect is particularly strong when secured credit is coming from a non-leader bank, right? So that's what's happening. And when you have the leader bank, which is this last 4 columns, the coefficient flips then. So in areas where the law should have affected the most, the secured leaders, these leader banks are actually decreasing credit as a result of the reform. So if anything, a little bit worse, okay? As a result. So the bottom line is that smaller firms are affected the most by the reform, and non-leader banks are the ones driving these results. And if we look at this effect for young versus old firms as well, and this I'm separating here based on the median age in my sample, you can see that the same thing applies. Younger firms are the ones that experience a higher increase in credit in areas that are more efficient. And this is being driven by non-leader banks as well. And then financial constraints, you might think maybe these local leader banks are larger banks, so maybe they're not benefiting as much because they're already relaxed, their constraints are relaxed. If you think of our small bank, maybe he's reacting mostly because now this actually can free up some capital for this bank to lend to other borrowers as well. So what I do is kind of interact bank level outcomes with my difference in difference, and you can see that the effects remain the same, and that local leader banks are the ones that react the most after the reform, and these interactions don't show much significance, showing that there doesn't seem to be any differential treatment effect for banks that are more or less constrained. Okay, so the results seem to be explained by its local leaders, being local leader or not, right? Being a bank that is kind of not an incumbent bank in that area. The final thing that we do, but I'm just going to go really quickly, is to address endogeneity. We're going to exploit requirements that actually every municipality needs to have a judicial district, to have a court in their municipality. If they don't respect these requirements based on population, its number of cases, sentence, etc., then this municipality is not going to get a court. Therefore, the cases of that municipality are going to be sentenced by a different court, right? In a different municipality, neighboring municipality. So if you think for every municipality, the number of neighboring municipalities that do not meet the requirement can actually predict the number of cases that are going to be sentenced by the municipality in the center itself, because now this municipality might need to actually take care of the case of these neighboring municipalities. And this strongly predicts actually court congestion, so this number of neighboring municipalities that do not meet the requirement, and it's likely to be uncorrelated with other factors that might explain court congestion. And when I use this new measure instead of court congestion, you see the results remain the same. So local leaders the results for local leaders are the ones that matter the most. So just to conclude, so this paper shows that stronger credit rights improve bank competition and affect banking market structure, right? So non-incumbent banks credit increase the most after the strengthening of credit rights. And this result seems to be explained by information asymmetry, right? The collateral reduces the market power of incumbent banks. And the main takeaway of the paper is that bank competition is another channel through which credit rights might affect loan terms as well. So the next steps is this is very preliminary work. You should look at the real effects of the stronger bank competition, right, on local employment and income, and the effects of financial stability of this increase in competition as well, which is not exactly clear. Too much competition can actually harm financial stability, and too little maybe as well. So thank you very much for your attention. So we finished the session in the sense of the presentations. Now with the remaining time, which is about 5 minutes, we can have Q&A. Any questions from the floor?
I had a question for Diego, and one for you also. No, Diego, I think we talked about it at some point, but I think you were pointing to the channels of why bankruptcy could, why the minimum wage could affect bankruptcy. In the reduced form, that's a partial equilibrium effect, right? Because I think when you were mentioning the channels, that could you mentioned a couple that could be kind of generic equilibrium channels. So those wouldn't be picked up in the regression, but maybe in a model, maybe it could even flip the sign of the effect of the minimum wage reform, right, on bankruptcy. I don't know if you've thought about that.
Yes, we interpret that as a just partial equilibrium reduced form effect on bankruptcy. Yes, we would like to do it in a quantitative model to kind of see more of the general equilibrium effect.
What Diego, I think related to that, I don't know what you could do, especially based, right? I mean, it's very timely paper, especially after this, the Nobel Prize, right, by David Card. But what you could do is exploit a bit his idea. I mean, one of his idea is that small changes in minimum wage are going to bring this benefit, right, of increasing income. If there's a large change, though, there might be these effects on employment. So maybe you should just interact this minimum wage with large changes or small, large changes, small changes, something like that, and see if the effects flip for a large change, right? Since you have very rich state level data, you might be able to do that as well. So it's a differential effect. Different changes in wages are going to have this different effect, right?
Yeah, no, this is a great point. And just as I mentioned, this debate of the effect of minimum wages on employment is kind of recently, again, it seems like 2 years ago when I was reading papers about this effect, seems like the effect was small. Now there's a paper of Clements and others that thinks that, as you said, depending on the size, it can be large. And also there's other paper by Rush and others that saying, okay, maybe in the short run can be small, but in the medium long run can be high. Related to what Joaquin said, in that case, that will have like a general equilibrium effect on the price of capital and all other inputs that can adjust, and that can have a higher effect on employment.
Yeah. Any other questions? I have a question for Joaquin. I mean, but it's very, I mean, it's very interesting paper. I mean, but not from much from this literature. So, what justifies these changes, right? In this utility functions, basically have this temptation, right? And this other change commitment. I think, if I'm not mistaken, these other changes. I mean, I understand they are based on these previous papers, one in the Econometrica. But what kind of justifies? It's kind of they're a little bit given, right? I mean, it's an exogenous, right? What kind of the justifies this kind of changes in the utility function?
So you mean why introduce this kind of agents?
Yeah.
Right.
Exogenous.
Yeah, so
based on observation, right? I mean.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically you look at there's some empirical papers and there's one experimental paper where they do like experiments, to measure in patients, but also time inconsistency. And yeah, you actually see there's a combination of people that are hitting in empirical papers, like people that have liquidity shocks, but then people that are impatient, people with these tests show they're time inconsistent. They have like this demand reversals in their preferences in the short run and in the long run. And also, looking at these valuations, all that was a big hint because they were so heterogeneous and yeah, definitely people seem to be different in that respect.
But do you need that for you to have this scenario of overborrowing, for instance? Because if do you need that, or is that a critical step? Because I think about zombie firms literature when for instance interest rates are too low, right? I mean, it can be either because the firms have this kind of behavior, right? Or it can be just the banks that is actually just pricing it wrongly. I don't know. They're giving a lower interest.
Yeah. So the reason of putting these agents is there's some hope for regulation with these guys because by design, you protecting them is good. You can also think what you were saying. And this is actually what it's a spin-off paper basically. We see these different. Think about, well, maybe these lenders are not so sophisticated. They're not pricing correctly their loans. There could still be some. We're working on. We'll be working on that. It's the asymmetric information could interact with the temptation, but even without the temptation, only that could be enough. That's one of the other frictions that we're looking at. Absolutely. It's not in this paper, but it's one to consider for sure.
Very interesting. Thank you.
A related question to that, Joaquin. So the kind of the key result in the paper was that I forgot the a borrowing constraint. How was it? I forgot the second name.
Exogenous regulatory borrowing.
Exogenous borrowing constraint had actually it creates welfare losses for people suffering from these temptation issues, right? And that was kind of surprising because when I was thinking about why should we have this kind of regulation, and I was thinking about there are people like having these temptation problems and they have this over borrowing because they don't know, they are, I don't want to say stupid, but I don't know, they have this behavioral problem.
They're perfectly rational. They just have this problem.
Yeah, the behavioral problem, the temptation problem that, I was thinking that the purpose of this kind of regulation was to prevent them from getting into this over borrowing and that kind of stuff, right? So, and in that way, prevent lenders to abuse this behavioral issue with these people, right? but it is surprising that actually quantitatively you found that this regulation actually is making them worse, right? Um, I don't know if you can, probably you said already, but maybe you can explain me again, why is that in the model? Why?
Yeah. So basically, the issue is basically that lenders are preventing your, if you're constrained, sorry, if your temptation and your actual choices are constrained, there's no over borrowing. There's no room for the exogenous limit from the lender. Not for everybody, because there are some people that face great price schedules because they're low risk, but that's not it. That's the more it exaggerates high income borrowing. So you still have people that benefit from it, but quantitatively it's just not enough. But then if you consider that the model, the model just allows you to go to the payday lender. So relatively high incomes are exaggerated in the model. So it's even, the losses are probably biased. They're probably even bigger. But it's basically that the lenders are already taking care of, they're already constraining the household. That avoids the overborrowing point.
So yeah, in the model, this overborrowing is not happening, even though in reality,
it is happening. It is happening, but it's not enough. It's not enough. It's because the relatively low income household, they're facing very tight price schedules. They want more credit, not less, for good reasons, not for bad reasons.
Okay. And also I had a short question if we had time for Dima. Yes, I guess you already answered in part, because you were considering like a different for different municipalities, like a different, I forgot the name you use, worse firms. I think that you said in one of your exercise. Did you also were able to look at the differences based on different firm size? If there is a difference between, if you consider different the size of the firm, because I was thinking that, and especially when you just mentioned that there is this cap now in the new regulation in terms of how much they can pay to workers. And I guess that is that cap constant, or is depending on the size of the firm, whether that matters for the results?
Oh, sorry. Was it? No, sorry.
That was for you, Dima.
I see. Sorry. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I mean, it's
Sure.
4 a.m. here. I'm a bit slow, so sorry.
Oh, sure, no problem. No, yeah. I think that you mentioned something about worse firms and also considering the quality of firms. And I was thinking also whether you consider that the firms are, the size of the firm are different in these municipalities, or the average firm size is different, and also especially I think it's interesting whether these caps that there is on wages that they have to pay, that the priority depends on the size of the firm. Size understood as number of workers, maybe can be other measures.
True. I could have exploited that. I mean, Brazil have data on this employment, so we could actually look at the wages pre-reform and see which firms are more exposed by that. Is a very good point that I can exploit much more the richness of that. This difference in size in municipalities, I think it's a bit addressed by the difference, because what I'm actually doing is comparing within the same municipality, firms that are more or less larger or smaller. So it's actually controlling for I have firm fixed effects, municipality cross-time fixed effects as well in that specification. So it's actually been really comparing within that municipality kind of effect. I don't think it should be so much of an issue, but it could exploit that as well. I mean, that's a firm level kind of effect. Thanks for the comments.
Can I ask you one last question? So
sure.
You were looking at secured credit, but I think when you used the question was like affect the collateral. Do you have data on unsecured credit or firms? These effects could be stronger, right?
We could have, yeah. The fact that I'm not exploiting it, but maybe I should, is that, as I said, the effects maybe should be larger, or maybe should be smaller as well. I mean, because secured credit should be affected the most. It depends on, I think it's going to depend on, depending on what Diego said, maybe depending on the wages of each firm, then how much is actually going to be available for unsecured creditors might change after the reform, or vis-a-vis before the reform. So I think the fact that I'm not using too much secured creditors, because I don't know whether theoretically whether the effect should be stronger or actually smaller after the reform, or maybe smaller, no, but at least not an effect, right? I think there shouldn't be an effect because there is no an effect. There basically didn't effectively change, right, in secured creditors. Because as you saw from the graph, the doing business 15% recovery rate for secured creditors suggests that more often than not, unsecured creditors is even worse than that, right? So even if there is this change, I think it was very small. So I don't know. Some people ask me to unsecured credit for a robust, for a validation test, saying it shouldn't affect. Some people say it should affect, and some people say it should affect even more because maybe before it was basically zero, really zero. Now it's something.
Yeah, maybe the really big, maybe the really good courts.
Yeah. So maybe I should kind of exploit it, but I don't have a theoretical prediction for it right now. So it's kind of, yeah, I need to think a little bit more about it. But it's a very good suggestion. Thank you. So let's finish a bit the session then. Very good discussions. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.
Have a nice rest of the day.
Have a nice night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.